On the afternoon of November 22, 1963, a man who had commanded the greatest military operation in human history, who had stared down Nazi generals, who had ordered troops into Normandy knowing thousands would die, sat in quiet retirement in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and received news that would shake even his iron composure to its very core. Dwight David Eisenhower, the 34th President of the United States, the Supreme Commander of Allied forces in World War II, the man who had helped build the very world John Fitzgerald Kennedy was now leading, learned in an instant that the young president he had handed power to less than 3 years earlier had been shot in Dallas, Texas. And what happened next, what Eisenhower said, what he felt, and what he did in the hours and days that followed, reveals something profound not just about two men, but about the soul of American leadership at its most fragile and consequential moment. This is not just a story about death. This is a story about power, succession, dignity, and the weight of history falling on human shoulders. If this kind of story moves you, if history told this way makes you feel something real, then subscribe to this channel right now. Like this video, share it with someone who loves history, and drop a comment below telling us something you didn't know before watching. Your support keeps these stories alive. To understand Eisenhower's reaction, you must first understand the complicated, layered relationship between these two men. Dwight Eisenhower was born on October 14, 1890, in Denison, Texas, and raised in Abilene, Kansas, a product of the American heartland, shaped by discipline, duty, and an almost sacred sense of national service. John Kennedy was born on May 29, 1917, in Brookline, Massachusetts, into wealth, privilege, and political ambition, a product of a world Eisenhower had never inhabited. When Kennedy ran for president in 1960, he ran in part against Eisenhower's legacy, famously warning of a missile gap with the Soviet Union that Eisenhower's own classified intelligence showed did not exist. Eisenhower was privately furious. He considered Kennedy's rhetoric reckless and politically dishonest. The transition of power on January 20, 1961, on that frozen Washington morning, had been civil but cold. Kennedy delivered his soaring inaugural address, "Ask not what your country can do for you," while Eisenhower, sitting behind him in his top hat, watched with the measured expression of a man who had seen enough history to know that words and reality were often very different things. The two men were separated not just by a generation, but by entirely different philosophies of power, leadership, and America's role in a dangerous world. Yet history has a way of forcing men together despite their differences, and in the first months of Kennedy's presidency, the two were drawn into a crisis that would define their complicated bond forever. In April of 1961, a brigade of approximately 1,400 Cuban exiles, trained and equipped by the Central Intelligence Agency, landed at a place called the Bay of Pigs on the southern coast of Cuba with the intention of overthrowing Fidel Castro. The operation had been conceived and developed under the Eisenhower administration, approved in principle before Kennedy ever took office. Kennedy inherited it, was briefed on it, modified it in ways that military planners later said fatally compromised its chances, and then authorized it. It failed catastrophically. The brigade was overwhelmed. Men were captured. The United States was humiliated on the world stage. Kennedy publicly took full responsibility, famously saying that victory has 100 fathers, but defeat is an orphan. Eisenhower, contacted immediately by the new president, drove from Gettysburg to Camp David on April 22, 1961, to meet with Kennedy privately. What passed between them in those rooms has been partially reconstructed from notes and later interviews. Eisenhower was blunt. He pressed Kennedy on why Air Cover had been canceled. Kennedy had no satisfying answer. But when they emerged, Eisenhower stood beside the young president and expressed public support. Whatever his private frustrations, Eisenhower understood that the office itself demanded a kind of loyalty that transcended personal disagreement. That meeting at Camp David in April 1961 established a pattern that would persist until the moment everything was shattered on November 22, 1963. Eisenhower and Kennedy continued to consult, sometimes warmly, sometimes tensely. During the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962, 13 days in October, when the world stood closer to nuclear annihilation than it ever had before or has since, Kennedy called Eisenhower directly on October 22, 1962, to brief him before his address to the nation. Eisenhower listened carefully as Kennedy explained that Soviet missiles with nuclear capability had been confirmed in Cuba, just 90 miles from the coast of Florida. According to notes kept by Eisenhower aide General Andrew Goodpaster, Eisenhower was largely supportive of the naval blockade strategy, though he privately believed a more forceful military response might have been warranted. He told Kennedy to be firm. Kennedy was. The Soviet ships turned back. The missiles were removed. The world exhaled. In the aftermath, Eisenhower gave Kennedy measured but genuine credit. He recognized in the young president something he had perhaps underestimated: a capacity for steadiness under existential pressure, a willingness to resist the loudest voices in the room and choose restraint over catastrophe. It was not yet admiration, but it was the beginning of something approaching respect. By the autumn of 1963, Eisenhower had settled into the rhythms of retirement in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, the same town where 100 years earlier, in July of 1863, the bloodiest battle of the American Civil War had been fought, a coincidence of geography that Eisenhower, a lifelong student of military history, never found trivial. He rose early, painted, wrote his memoirs, received visitors, and stayed closely connected to Republican Party politics. He watched with the practiced eye of an old general as Kennedy navigated an increasingly turbulent landscape, the civil rights movement reaching a boiling point, a commitment in Vietnam deepening in ways that troubled many, and an economy that was beginning to show real strength. Kennedy was planning for re-election in 1964, and the trip to Texas in November was partly political, aimed at healing a bitter feud within the Texas Democratic Party between Governor John Connally and Senator Ralph Yarborough. The presidential motorcade was scheduled to pass through downtown Dallas on November 22nd, winding through Dealey Plaza in open view of thousands of people who had lined the streets to see the young president and his wife, Jacqueline, who was dressed in a pink Chanel suit that would become one of the most haunting images in American history. At approximately 1 p.m. Central Standard Time on November 22nd, 1963, John Fitzgerald Kennedy was pronounced dead at Parkland Memorial Hospital in Dallas, Texas. He was 46 years old. He had been struck by gunfire while riding in the presidential limousine through Dealey Plaza at 12:30 p.m. Governor John Connally, seated in front of him, was also gravely wounded, but survived. Within the hour, the world knew. Television broadcasts were interrupted. Anchors wept on air. Children were pulled from classrooms. In cities across America and around the world, people stopped walking, stopped working, stood in the street or sat in front of television sets, and felt something crack open inside them that had never cracked before. And in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, the old general received the news. According to accounts from people close to him, including his son John Eisenhower and members of his staff, Eisenhower was visibly shaken. The man who had never flinched during the planning of Operation Overlord, who had signed orders knowing the carnage they would produce, who had walked through the ruins of the Nazi concentration camp at Ohrdruf in April 1945 and forced himself to witness the full horror of what had been done. That man went pale. He went quiet. And then, after a long moment, he said something that those who heard it never forgot. By the midpoint of this story, you are standing at the exact hinge of history. And if this narrative is moving you, please take a moment right now to subscribe to this channel, like this video, and share it with someone in your life who deserves to feel the weight of real history. Leave a comment below. Tell us what surprised you most so far. It means more than you know. What Eisenhower said, according to the recollections of those present and his own later writings and statements, reflected not just grief, but a kind of deep, structural sorrow. The sorrow of a man who understood at a cellular level what the murder of a sitting president meant for the Republic. He reportedly said, with characteristic directness, that it was a terrible thing for the country. He used the word shocked, not a word Eisenhower used casually. He expressed immediate concern not for politics, not for party, but for the continuity of government, for the safety of the nation's leadership structure, for what this meant in the context of the Cold War. Was this an act of war? Was it a conspiracy? Was the Soviet Union involved? Was Cuba? These were not paranoid questions in November 1963. They were the rational calculations of a man who had spent his entire adult life thinking about geopolitical threats, asymmetric attacks, and the vulnerabilities of open societies. Eisenhower understood, perhaps better than almost anyone alive, that the assassination of a president was not just a human tragedy. It was a potential act of destabilization. It was a kind of blow that, in less stable nations, preceded coups, invasions, and the collapse of governments. In the days that followed November 22nd, Eisenhower's conduct revealed the full depth of his character. He reached out immediately to Jacqueline Kennedy, expressing his condolences with the formal restraint of a man of his generation, but with evident sincerity. He reached out to the new president, Lyndon Baines Johnson, who had been sworn into office aboard Air Force One at Love Field in Dallas at 2:38 p.m. on November 22nd, with Jacqueline Kennedy standing beside him, still wearing the pink suit stained with her husband's blood. An image so raw and so devastating that it remains almost unbearable to look at even today. Eisenhower pledged his full cooperation to Johnson. He offered counsel. He offered whatever institutional knowledge and moral authority he possessed. In his diary and in letters written during that period, Eisenhower reflected on the fragility of democratic governance, on the way that violence could tear at the fabric of a nation, and on the responsibility of those who had served in high office to help hold the country together in moments of rupture. This was not performance. This was not political calculation. This was a soldier's response to a battlefield crisis: assess the damage, stabilize the position, and hold the line. There is one more dimension to Eisenhower's reaction that history has not always emphasized, and it is perhaps the most humanly revealing of all. Despite the tensions of their relationship, despite the political differences, despite the Bay of Pigs frustrations and the campaign rhetoric and the philosophical distances between them, Eisenhower had, over the course of nearly 3 years, developed a genuine, if quiet and complicated, regard for Kennedy as a president and as a man. He had watched Kennedy face down the Soviet Union in October 1962 with a steadiness that reminded Eisenhower of the qualities he most valued in a leader. He had watched Kennedy navigate the gathering storm of the civil rights movement, delivering his landmark civil rights address to the nation on June 11, 1963, just 5 months before Dallas, with a moral clarity that even Kennedy's critics found difficult to dismiss entirely. Eisenhower, who had himself desegregated the United States Armed Forces through executive action in the late 1940s and had sent federal troops to Little Rock, Arkansas, in September 1957 to enforce school desegregation, understood the political courage that commitment to civil rights required. He may not have agreed with every choice Kennedy made, but he recognized the weight Kennedy was carrying. And now that weight had been transferred, violently irreversibly, to Lyndon Johnson, and the world had changed in ways that no one yet fully understood. On November 25, 1963, the state funeral of John Fitzgerald Kennedy took place in Washington, D.C. The procession moved from the Capitol, where Kennedy had lain in state and where hundreds of thousands of people had stood in lines stretching for miles to pay their respects, to the White House, and then to St. Matthew's Cathedral for the funeral mass, and finally to Arlington National Cemetery, where Kennedy was buried on a hillside with a view across the Potomac River toward the Lincoln Memorial. Eisenhower attended. He was 73 years old, his health beginning to show the strain of age and decades of pressure. He walked and stood with the dignity that had always defined him. Representatives of nearly 100 nations were present. Charles de Gaulle of France was there. Prince Philip of the United Kingdom was there. Haile Selassie of Ethiopia was there. The world had come to bury a man who had been in office for just 1,036 days. Eisenhower watched the burial with the stillness of a man who had attended many funerals, too many, and who understood that the ceremony was not for the dead, but for the living, not for Kennedy alone, but for the nation that needed to find a way to continue. He understood, perhaps more than most, that what was being buried on that hillside in Arlington was not just a president, but a particular kind of American promise, young, brilliant, unfinished, and now forever frozen at the moment of its interruption. History does not always give us clean endings. Eisenhower lived for more than 5 years after Dallas, dying on March 28, 1969, at Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Washington, D.C., at the age of 78, from congestive heart failure. In those 5 years, he watched Lyndon Johnson escalate the war in Vietnam into a catastrophe that would eventually consume his presidency, destroy the great society he had dreamed of, and leave 58,000 American names carved into a black wall in Washington. He watched Robert Kennedy, John's younger brother, the Attorney General who had wept openly on November 22nd and who had rebuilt himself into a presidential candidate, assassinated in Los Angeles on June 5, 1968, just moments after winning the California primary. He watched Martin Luther King Jr. shot dead on a motel balcony in Memphis on April 4, 1968. He watched a nation in convulsion, its cities burning, its campuses erupting, its faith in its own institutions fracturing under the pressure of war, inequality, and grief. And through all of it, the old general from Abilene, Kansas, maintained the posture he had always maintained: upright, disciplined, sober, committed to the idea that the Republic would survive, that it had survived worse, that the work of building and preserving a democratic civilization was never finished and never easy, but was always, always worth doing. What Eisenhower said when he heard about Kennedy's assassination was not a speech. It was not a proclamation. It was the quiet, devastated response of a man who had given everything to a country and who understood, in that terrible moment, what it meant to watch that country wounded at its very center. He said it was a terrible thing. He said he was shocked. He worried about the nation. And then he did what great men do in moments of crisis. He steadied himself. He reached out to those who needed him, and he put his shoulder back against the wheel of history. If this story has moved you, if the weight of these lives and these moments has settled somewhere inside you, then please subscribe to this channel right now, like this video, share it with someone you believe deserves to carry this history with them, and leave a comment below telling us what part of the story you had never heard before, what surprised you, what made you feel something you didn't expect to feel. These stories belong to all of us. History is not the past. History is the ground we are standing on right now. And knowing where we stand is the only way to know where we are going.